May I just ask a question? You know, right from the very beginning, I think I indicated to you that there is understood to be some kind of a problem when an older man who is two or three generations, or at least two generations removed, speaks to another generation. Because what goes through my mind, the images, the associations, they're part of my life. Much of it was lived in Europe, it was in another time, you know, things were different. Now a new generation comes along, and it really ties in with the question I asked of Jordan, because I see what's going on, and I don't know know the mindset of the young generation. So after having held forth here for something like 2.5 hours so far, I have absolutely no insight into the correspondence of what you received and what I intended to tell you. You understand what I'm saying? It's a little bit, I always think of a radio transmitter. They can have the biggest power output and money put into everything and doing work very hard to have programming. But it all depends on having sets that are actually tunable to that particular wavelength, because if in the worst case, not a single set can tune in, and they're talking to themselves. They don't even know it. Do you understand what I'm saying? To what extent, how can you give me an idea of, well, what have you learned, or what have you understood? Maybe each of you tell me a little bit, so I can see what does it amount to so far. Jordan, you want to say?
I guess.
Well, it's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I've learned is kind of what you were talking about, like this whole difference of generations, but then also with the experiences you've had, you know, because it's also a different cultural thing being in Germany, and so it's a different environment than I'm used to anyway, and then a different time period than I'm used to.
It's a little bit like if I were to listen to a very old man from the provinces of China or something like that.
Yeah.
You know, it's very interesting, very curious. I guess there's not much we can do about it. All right, then.
Okay. My first question was, we had talked about you were in London, and you had brought your sister over, and I just wanted to know what life was like for you during the war while you were in London.
Yeah, that's a very good question. When I first came to London, it was a peaceful country, and I've told you the rabbi had arranged, Louis Rabinowitz was his name. I think he had a doctor, had arranged for us to live in a hostel being a place where it's like almost like an orphanage. You know, it's people providing shelter and food for kids, other people's kids that came from some other place and needed to somehow go forward. Immediately, things became very clear. Most of the kids, myself included, came from middle-class families. I had expectations to go to university and make something of myself. It was immediately clear that the people who were sheltering us were concerned about giving us some food for the day, and they would be on our own. As far as educational expenses or supervision or anything like that was not in their plan. And it was made clear to the kids that as best they could, that they couldn't expect anything. And I think the kids, only being 13 years old, didn't know what it meant. But it really meant they went to school with working class English kids. Schooling was far below what they had received at the Yavne, and I think, as you can expect, and maybe I've mentioned this already, it caused friction after a while, because these kids were getting restless. The kind of instruction they were getting were pretty nothing, and the teachers felt the kids sometimes knew more than they did. And that's not exactly what they were looking for. So here there were strangers coming along. Also, my sister, for instance, as the war went along and bombing started, was evacuated to, I think it was Nottingham. It was a smaller town in the countryside. Why? Because the Germans started to bomb the city. In fact, they cleared out the entire inner city by throwing incendiary bombs. After the war, or during the war, after the bombings, I've been in the city where, for instance, in the area of St. Paul's Cathedral, which is a huge structure, which incidentally was spared. That one building was spared. A bomb went through the cupola right into the crypt and it didn't explode. And civilian experts went in there, or maybe sappers. The sappers were the people, engineers who dealt with unexploded bombs, were sent in there anyway. They defused it. But what about the surroundings of the St. Paul's Cathedral? It was like Vietnam. Like have you seen pictures of the atom bomb in Nagasaki and Hiroshima? Have you ever seen pictures of that? Well, that's what it looked like. And the Germans did that. Every night they came for a period. Let me say that the first part of my stay then was peaceful. The kids, younger kids went to school, and the development for the Germans was in the east, confronting with the Russians. Started there. So the Western Front was pretty quiet. But then things changed. And now I'm teaching you history. What happened is the Germans attacked in the West, and where the French, with their typical thinking of the military to fight the last war, had prepared a huge line of defenses called the Maginot Line. But they had, in a very stupid way, totally left out of the consideration that all the Germans had to do go through the countries adjoining Belgium and Holland to walk into France behind the Maginot Line. The Maginot Line wouldn't play any part. That's what the Germans did. So they started. It doesn't seem that it takes a lot of thinking to outthink the general staff of the French army when you consider what they had recommended and how little worth it was. But anyway, then the attack started, and the Germans were hugely successful initially, and they cut off a British contingent that was on French soil, and the British made a heroic attempt at Dunkirk, to salvage that army, even in little boats. I wouldn't say rowing boats, but everybody had a private boat even, went out across in order to take some people off the beaches. And essentially they salvaged the whole army. What am I saying? I'm giving you a background of what was going on in the world, in the war itself. That had, of course, immediate effect on the British. After Dunkirk, they felt much more vulnerable to having just had what amounted to a retreat, a dangerous retreat, a salvage of their personnel. They lost all their equipment, of course, guns, everything. The Germans were entrenched in France, occupied it. And therefore the British then started to think about, well, we have given shelter to some, what you would call refugees. That included the young people. They had also some older people that hadn't gotten there. For instance, for some Jewish women in Germany, they had taken an opportunity to come as domestics. The British need people to work in homes. And if you applied for that, some people were able to go to England that way. There were also exceptional people who had somehow managed to get there, but not very many. The numbers were not large. But the British had to ask themselves, with all these Germans, they didn't say these are Jews, they said they're Germans, they're German Jews. Maybe there are spies amongst them. What do we do? How do we secure ourselves? Like we have to secure ourselves against the Muslims that want to maybe blow up things in this country. We have to take safety measures. Somebody has to be on the watch. They discussed that for 2 days in Parliament, in the middle of the war. What should we do with him? And they decided to put certain people and age groups and men and so forth, so also women, into internment camps. In other words, this is more like prisoner of war type of status. I've already indicated to you by that time I was for the English I was German, but as far as the Germans are concerned, they had made me stateless. You know, I had no passport, no German passport, just an identity card which I've shown you. And so I had obtained permission from the committee that was involved with the hostel, from the congregation. I said I would really like to take a Cambridge matriculation examination, and I prepared for it, or I started to prepare for it, and they were reluctant, but then I had one person who spoke for me, and they said, okay, if you want to take it, don't take it. I don't know, there might have been an expense, but by that time I had already started to work in a pharmacy as a helper for one pound a week. Today a pound is about what we would consider $2. So for that amount I worked for a whole week. The guy was exploiting me actually, but I had to do something. I was the oldest and they didn't expect me to look to them for any sustained support. Well, anyway, in the evening I went to classes, and you have to understand, in that time, that was still before the heavy bombing started. Nevertheless, the British were keenly aware that if there should be air attacks, a huge city like London would be like a carnival seen from the air. The lights abounding, easy to just knowing exactly where to drop the bombs. And so they arranged for a blackout. In other words, no light could be shown. And it was very effective. Even the buses that were still running had a black guard with just a tiny little slit across for a little bit of light to shine out. That certainly couldn't be seen from the air, but it was just phenomenal to move around in total darkness. I don't know whether you've ever been in total darkness without any light. So I was advised by mail, or the details are not clear to me, that as of another few days I would be interned, and the people actually, I think they came for me. Cut a long story short, the examination was a week later. All the work I had done, and I had gone to evening classes on my own. It would have been down the tube. It's what they call an intermediate examination. There's, after 2 years, an intermediate examination before you can progress to a bachelor's degree. And so I pleaded, apparently convincingly, and they let me go another week. Just after the exam, I wasn't like taken in, and then I stayed for 6 months, first in tents in Shropshire. Shropshire is a county in England adjoining Wales, in a tent, in tents, and you know, there were chow lines for people with tin cans to get your food, but there was no other care taken. It was quite different from the concentration camp, which was engineered to be humiliating and to be debasing and to injure. I mean, the people there were supposed to suffer. In England, they correctly just dealt with people, just holding them. At one time, I remember we were next to a prisoner of war camp. There was a wire between us and the Germans on the other side. It was boring as heck. Pretty soon some of the younger people there started, they had a theater group, I don't know what was, you know, this improvisation, and then it got cold. And then they took us from the tent city in Shropshire, in England, on a boat to the Isle of Man, which is in the Irish Sea between England and Ireland. The big city there, or the largest of the settlements there, is called Douglas. And they had Douglas in peacetime used to be a destination for vacationers. And they took a few blocks, put a barbed wire around it, and that was then the new internment camp. The total time I spent there was 6 months. I don't know, how much time I should spend. I didn't have anything to do, I grew a beard. I was like, how old are you? 19?
19.
So I was 18. And when each house registered who was coming in additionally, when we got in, there was this one guy who was maybe in his 30s, quite a well-known guy and a lawyer. He took particularly asked me age, and I said 18. He looked up and said, 18? Apparently that gave me a greater gravity with beard. What do I remember? I can go on and on. I'll tell you something that matters to me. In Douglas, it was called the Hutchinson camp, actually, in Douglas. For people who had female family members, maybe a man who had his wife. I happened to have a cousin who also got sent to the Isle of Man in a separate camp because it was a woman. And every once in a while, they actually allowed meetings, so they took people out and they had a chance to meet. And so I met my cousin once or twice, I forget how much, in that period. So what I want to say is something that I remember, maybe with some satisfaction, is there was one guy there. Most of them were Jewish, of course, they were refugees, but there were people from mixed marriages, and maybe one or two other people there. Whatever. There was this one guy, he was maybe 3 years older than me, and a lot heavier and bigger than me. But I overheard him a number of times making derogatory remarks, which I interpreted as anti-Semitic. He just took it upon himself to have something to say. Yeah, he was with everybody else in the country. And I don't know, it passed. But it didn't pass with me. It bothered me. So, cut a long story short, I arranged for somebody to tell this guy to come to our house, the house that I was assigned to. And from the front door, you went all the way back into the kitchen, down a few steps into the kitchen with a door. I arranged for this guy coming in there, and I slammed the door shut behind him. And he didn't know what was going on. I didn't know, this was not a setup for a boxing match according to the rules of the Lord of Shrewsbury, something like that. I jumped the guy and gave him such a hiding. That's an English term, I guess, hiding. I gave him such a wallop. The guy went out of there in much, not in very good shape. It made me actually hear the people in my house thought it was okay. He deserved it. Why nobody else took care of him, I don't know. But this is my nature, and I did that. So after that, I didn't hear him say very much anymore. Maybe that helped to make him understand. He needed to be told firmly. Then I was released after 6 months because I wanted to continue my studying. And when I came back, I had to make a living. Of course, in wartime, you have to have there's supervision of everything, and particularly labor. And I ended up in a demolition work. That, in other words, now getting back to the destruction, all the destruction wrought in London needed to be cleared up. And so I ended up doing this very heavy laboring work for a while. I don't know, there's so much to tell you. It's, yes, well, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to ask, were you in London during the entire war, or did you, because I know...
Yes.
Okay.
It was during the war. Of course, eventually I worked in war industry.
Mm-hmm.
I might add this. The British made it possible for people in the internment camp to join the army, but only the Pioneer Corps. The Pioneer Corps, in a normal service conditions, was for people who were very often mentally challenged. They wanted to use them. Somebody had to unload trains and so forth, or do heavy labor, and that was the Pioneer Corps. But they didn't fancy these German young guys to go in the army and running around with side-armed weapons, maybe, or whatever. That was a limited opportunity, and I did not want to take that. The people who did take that, and I had friends who did, who got out and got in the army, there was one. His name was Martin Levin. He became Martin Lewis. I guess that had to do with recognition as a Jew in the army. The Germans might have got. He became, in due course, a parachutist. He fought in North Africa. He was in the Battle of Arnhem, which was a critical conquest of a bridge that allowed American troops and English troops to get across to Germany, having to cross there. I would like to just add this, that all the people, of course, were killed amongst those. After the war, the British did not automatically or in any way facilitate British citizenship. They could, like everybody else, apply after the war. It was a very meager reward for having fought there. And I had made it clear if I would want to be given a chance for officer status. In fact, I had independently applied to the British Air Force, RAF, and I also, since the Americans were there, I applied to the Air Force. They chose not to take me. That was another matter. It wasn't that I wanted to avoid service, but I wasn't going to unload all these trains with a prejudiced notion that this was where I fitted in best. As it turned out, I worked for a large electronic company called RANK, INK, also in the film industry on the technical end, and there I worked on semiconductors, which perhaps was more useful than me unloading trains or something like that. So as the conditions in London were severe, extreme rationing, and now again I have to say, not only did they destroy the city of London with incendiary bombs, but in due course they had rockets, A1 and A2. They just shot them off and they landed anywhere. And of course a lot of damage and a lot of people died in the city. It was a war zone. And many people with families had made a habit every night to go into a shelter. There were some shelters. The so-called tube, that's the underground, it's called the tube in London, was made available to people. So on the platforms, you had to always dodge the feet of family groups who had staked out certain areas where they would spend the next few years coming back again and again, sleeping underground. But that was the way the population lived. So it wasn't, but I decided it was either my fate or not. I was a young man, and so I slept in my bed, and when I heard the, what do they call it? What am I trying to say? The rockets. These were self-propelled, and they had a motor, you know. And so there would be air alarm, sirens all over London, and then I listen, and pretty soon I hear the thing coming closer and closer, and I decided, well, is it for me tonight or not? By the time it got over my head, I knew if it were the motor shut off and glide down, it would be somebody else's ticket there. So I just turned around and went to bed, went to sleep. I mean, it was whoever ticket it was, but I couldn't worry about it. You know, it's in the face of death, you can get callous, you get inured, like the people who lived in Auschwitz. My wife, the tent world came in every day. There were selections. People went mostly directly into gas chambers, with it, particularly the women and the little children, and the smoke came out of this. But the other people lived next to it, day in and day out, with the smoke drifting across for burnt flesh. But they knew. Everybody knew that maybe tomorrow they'll select me and I'll be there. But that had to be lived with. You can't imagine that, John, can you? You have to think about it. The iPod or something like that. There are different childhood experiences. Sometimes iPods, some of them live next to the extermination chimneys. So there's so much to tell. I have to be asked more specifically.
Okay. When did you come to the United? I guess I just sort of wanted to go into when did you come to the United States?
Well, finally the war came to an end. You know, I had long not heard my parents. I mentioned that they'd been sent away, and you know they were exterminated. They were murdered. I think it's silly to call them they were killed. They were murdered. Came to an end, and of course that was my priority to find out. Like at least my wife, my mother, I could trace her somehow, since some people did survive. And the Americans came, let it be known that they were interested in German-speaking personnel to hire for the War Department, because as they went into Germany, they wanted to supervise the postal communications, both the mail and the telephone services. Ostensibly, what they're basically saying is, if there are any Nazis and they need to be caught, let's just find out who's calling whom, and let's get a handle on it. So I volunteered for that. I was hired, and I went to Germany for a year in September of 1945. So that was just a couple of months after the end of the war. I went from England for 1 year to Germany. We were on an army base there, and we had uniforms. These were not military uniforms. They were khaki, but they had a distinct insignia on it. Just said U.S. I just wanted to tell you something, that I very quickly became aware of the fact the Americans weren't interested anymore in the Nazis. The whole denazification which then took place was done in a half-hearted way, because the Americans didn't think of the Germans as very bad. The fact that they killed 6 million Jews didn't bother anybody. Mr. Roosevelt, as you know, had been told from eyewitnesses that these murders were going on, and they said they couldn't send a single plane. It would impede the air effort. If they had dropped a bomb, some people would have died there. But they wouldn't have died every day by gas. But they bombed factories next to the extermination camp. There was a IG Farben chemical company, and they bombed there. So what I found out was the Americans were not that interested. Sometimes I had some general hiding in the Alps, and I wrote it up. I don't know. What they were really interested in was communists. Now you have to understand, communists, we started to have a confrontation with Russia. And that quickly became the dominant theme in everything we did. And in Germany there were no communists. The ones that existed had been in concentration camps and survived it maybe for 6 years. And I did find out about this one guy who had a little room someplace after he came out, and that was of greater interest than any of the Nazis that I had access to. So I did my duty. They wanted me to provide information. I did it. What they did with it was not my business. You understand?
Yes.
I'm giving you the truth. I don't know whether it's uncomfortable or not, but should I say it was a glorious experience? Well, it gave me an opportunity personally to see whether I could find anybody while I was there. Another thing that it was interesting, I had also civilian clothes, and I mixed with a population sometimes. But in all the time that I wore my uniform and talked to the Germans in German, I never had a single German, one. Now I'm telling you, I never had 2 Germans admit, one, that they were Nazis, 2, that they knew anything what was going on to the Jews. Now I told you, I think, how when I rounded the corner and looked at my house, they were standing around there, 3 or 5 lines crowded. If you had asked them after the war, they wouldn't have known, they remember anything, nothing. And when we were marched in the morning out of the prison, the jail, to be transported to Dachau in the morning, the people there, if you had asked them after the war, they would have said, what, me? I never saw anything. Only one lady, she was a kindergarten teacher. In the middle age, she said she had been a Nazi. So that's human, I don't know what to say. There's so much to tell. The Germans wanted to be friendly with the Americans who were the occupiers, victorious, and everything. It's a whole chapter. But what can I say? The women threw themselves at the Americans for little things. They wanted nylon stockings and everything else. And it was a disorganized period. Let me just say I did 1 year there, and then I left, went back, came to America. The German quarter was wide open at that time, so I and my sister came, and the German guy came here. For a few weeks I did casual, I think I mentioned I was a sandwich man for a while there in New York. Then I came here, and I heard about this university here, so I thought I have to do something. So I arranged to get into that, and I studied got myself a PhD degree in '51. I was 29 and a half years old by that time, an old man. But I'd lived through many different experiences, not only personal but culturally. I'd lived in Germany, I understood the Germans. I lived in England, and I'd gotten used to their ways. Now I came to America. Now I got to get used to the American way. Found it very difficult. Found that very difficult.
Why did you choose Baltimore from New York?
Well, that had to do with relatives living here, and also that was the main reason. I came visiting here, and then because I had made arrangements, got myself into the university here, so that determined that.
So when and how did you meet your wife?
That's sort of a lady's question of interest. Well, I tell you, my wife. Let me just briefly say that she was sent for the transport from Frankfurt, and I told you she was the only survivor of some. It's either 1,300 or 1,500 souls there on that boat. Only survivor. And then she went into Auschwitz. And when they closed that because the Russians were approaching, she was put on this death march where people had to walk in the snow and ice in Poland back into the German-held areas. You could go for weeks telling details about all this experience. When she came here, she ended up with the relatives. Now, who were these relatives? Her grandfather had an uncle, had a brother, who had immigrated to America in the 1860s. And he had children. The children, when Hilda came here, were ancient, old people. Particularly, Tessie was an old lady, and she had a maid and all. And I guess the idea was, well, let Hilda go. Some other relatives had arranged for her to go here, maybe as a lady's companion or something. I think the aunt thought of her more as another maid to take care of things for her. And that, under those conditions, trying to meet somebody, she had met my sister. My sister, was born in Germany and spoke perfect English because she had lived on a school in England. And so, to my Hilda, to my former wife, my wife of blessed memory, this was a godsend to have this young woman her own age, essentially, who she could spend a little time with, instead of the old lady who didn't understand anything. When she said, well, first of all, she didn't speak English, but to the extent that some communication took place, she was in a position of having to answer some questions. So, what did you do the last few years? How did you come here? She said, well, I was in a concentration camp. She said, the aunt would say, well, oh, that's too bad. Without knowing what the hell that meant, I mean, here you... The magnitude of the tragedy of this person, and here a comfortable old lady saying, oh, too bad. Well, let's move on to important things. What do we have for dinner? Things that matter in real life from day to day. So I think my sister had shown a picture of me, And it could have been this picture. I showed you my picture, didn't I, when I was a young kid? My wife said, she claims later on, she told my husband, I want to be the first one to meet this guy. Well, this came about actually. I visited an aunt that lived here, and Hilde came to the front door of my aunt's place there on Newington Avenue in Baltimore. I remember that, Newington Avenue. With my sister, and my sister said, "Yeah, we came to say hello." That was before I came from. I was still working as a sandwich man there in New York. I just came to visit my aunt, and my sister came, and I want you to introduce this young friend of mine. And I said hello. Well, what happened was, I guess the background was similar, and she really needed a more protective presence. It evolved from that I met her. We had dates. Yeah, we did have dates. I hadn't any money, and after I knew her, sometimes we went to a movie. Do you know Baltimore, downtown, Howard Street in downtown Baltimore? Do you know that by chance? Do you know Inner Harbor?
Yes.
Yeah, not far from there was a movie that all had European films, and it was air conditioned. We lived without air conditioning. And so how did we go there? We walked all the way, spent an hour there, and then we walked all the way back. That was maybe a total walk of 5 or 6 miles. But that's, if there's no money, how are you going to get there and enjoy the movie if you don't walk? Okay. I could, for instance, Coke was 5 cents a bottle. I didn't have the money. Maybe once in a blue moon I spent 5 cents on a bottle of Coke while I was a graduate student. So if I say conditions were different, if I had my own grandchildren and grandchildren, they have everything. I sometimes wonder why. They don't really need it. It's just other questions. It's all hit and miss, isn't it?
You had mentioned that when you were younger that you were, I guess, Reform or not practicing Jew, but you were now Orthodox. So I wanted to. This is perhaps the most significant thing that ever happened to me in my life, because I consider myself a sophisticated young man. Partly because I've been on my own all the time, and anything I want to do, I achieve by myself. Even getting Hopkins without transcription. Whether other people can do it or not, I don't know, but it was up to me. I'm a survivor. This is my number one role in life. If the chips are down, I will be survived on the other side. Whether the other people will be, I can be responsible for that. So, what was the question, please? What made you decide, I guess, to become more practicing?
Yeah. The way it was in Germany, I'm talking about German Jewry. Let's go back to a very well-known figure, Moses Mendelssohn. Have you ever heard of him?
No.
He was a significant personality at the time at which Jews, for the first time in Germany, had a chance to enter general society. Before that, they were restricted in every way, and he came to Berlin through a special gate for cattle and Jews. There were gates, the city. At the time he came wanted to travel to he had to go through the cattle gate with the cattle. I mean, this is how much, talking about German culture, German history, that's where the Jews stood 200 years ago. But generally, and I can't go into everything, there were outstanding families that were useful to the princes as bankers and so forth. You had privileged positions. So there were such people in Berlin, and Mendelssohn ended up at the household of one of those. So they got permission for him so he could stay in Berlin through connections and so forth. Why I talk about Mendelssohn? Because he was a Talmud scholar from having trained that way. Then he had a chance to get into German culture and became an outstanding personality that German cultural elites wanted to meet. And in this give and take, the other Jews which have found that opportunities arose, they took him as an example. Anyway, 40 years later, so now we are talking about 1810. After, through the leadership of this particular individual, Moses Mendelssohn, what is the Mendelssohn Bartholdy? What was his grandson? What is the composer? Do you know Mendelssohn? Never heard of Mendelssohn?
I don't study music.
It sounds familiar, but I don't know.
I have seen him a moment. I forget his first name. I will. I want to say that the Jews, and particularly those who had ambitions to want to get into academia, get to university, to take up, maybe get into civil service, anything like that. As a Jew, you couldn't do it, so they went to the baptismal fund. A third of all the Jews in Berlin, as early as 1810, had gotten and had water sprinkled on them. They were going by that time. It was opportunism, you know. It wasn't. It didn't have any. It wasn't out of great character. It's that's what they wanted to be, and so the reform movement arose in Germany, made big strides. So let me put it this way: in 1930, before Hitler came, more than 50%, better than 50% of German Jews in Germany intermarried. Now in America we have the same phenomenon today. You know, of the 5 million Jews that in America today, more than 2.5 million have no association with Judaism, not even with the Jewish Community Center. So there's this flight to get away from it. It was seen as something you really don't want. That was yesterday. It was something that was backward. It was something, and that was how I was more or less taught about it. I was a self-hating Jew. I went to school with the Nazis, and they were trim and they were great, and they were wearing uniforms, and I want to be one of them. And I could see the Jews through their eyes. My father would sometimes say, if I didn't had a military bearing, he would say, "Don't walk like a Jew boy there, you know, walk like a Nazi." That's the self-hated kid. And it was deeply ingrained with me. That's what I was taught. But only when I met my wife did I, for the first time, have any kind of inkling of a self-respecting Jewish personality in my life. And cut a long story short, when we had our first child, they handed her. First, she had trouble getting. First, she didn't want children. We had 4 years we didn't have children, and she explained it that the very idea of a Jewish child gave her creeps, because all the kids that she had seen in the house, that there was a Jewish child, they went automatically into the gas chamber. And then, having acclimatized and acculturated herself into a new life, one day then she was able to have children. They gave her baby for the first time, and she blessed her with the blessing, you know. This has to do with I should translate it now, I guess. Yeah.
I know what it is.
Yeah. And then progressively, she increased the stakes. For instance, we had at one point in our early marriage bought absolutely wonderful dishes, and we ate pork and everything else. My wife, she had nothing to eat in the camps, leaving kosher. And so for a while I was sort of like a goy. I ate anything, preferably shellfish and whatever was prescribed, made me a real man. So there I see these beautiful dishes just bought outside the garage where we were living. Come back from home, I said, Hilda, what's that stuff doing out there outside in the bathtub? Yeah, we can't use it anymore. Why not? He said, we've eaten pork from it. From now on, we're going to have kosher household. And I knew that I had nothing to give. Oh yes, did I know mathematics? I know science. I'm not a totally stupid man. I'm well read. But of the essence of what it means to raise children with self-respect and with identity that is not in crisis and so forth, I felt I was totally a babe in the woods. And basically what it amounted to, although we never had a written contract, was that I humbly said, this is the house, we have a general, the general is Hitler, whatever she says will be done, and I'm the kitchen boy, and I'll do what has to be done. And that's what I have done. And I'm hugely rewarded today, because I think I have told you that there was a sense of carrying into life, a sense of hope, of meaning, maybe even of a degree of holiness, to have the banal, the ordinary, in the thinking, and of raised to a level which comes when you have I believe in a higher power that sets the standards. If everything is situational, today I can permit myself that. Maybe I'm getting a little fat, so I won't do that. But whatever I said yesterday doesn't hold me today. I'm a modern man. Are you going to hold me to it? Under those conditions, you get kids who surprise you. They're having a party and they're having pot. They not eat pot, they have heroin. And they live in houses that most people couldn't afford. Because it doesn't matter what your position in life is, or how much you have, that if your personal status, your philosophy, your alignment for meaning in life is not of the right type, then everything else is secondary. Today I'm an old man, and if people tell me what's important, I would tell you, number one, good health. Because if you don't have good health, you got nothing. But if somebody presses me then and says, what else is, I would say, at least you're alive if you've got good health, that if you do not, that you must seek a somewhat transcendental orientation. If you ask me, am I a believer? I find it hard, with all my background, to totally fall in with all, but I do only have Orthodox friends, and I wouldn't want anybody else. The fact that I'm, let's say, a weak link, that they are graciously letting me partake in the experience of life that I experience, is a wonderful bonus to me. When I go to my daughter, I've just been for Rosh Hashanah, and they live in a very Jewish enclave. Everybody is like that. Mm-hmm. And they have, I've never seen do a meal. Sometimes they have 5 people invited, sometimes 15, and then we go out. They take me along wherever they go. And these are very intelligent people and always positive people and everything. And they have wonderful children, and that's where I belong. I don't need people. My son-in-law, Mark, He comes from a family that gave him nothing. He had wonderful friends, also Jewish friends. He became a veterinarian. He has one of the best practices in the veterinary field. You can imagine, he's really a very successful man. But his friends, they came along and they held out amongst themselves, meeting every month or once or twice for old time's sake, you know. He doesn't want to see them anymore. Why? These people went along, they got married, had children. Pretty soon they didn't like their wife anymore, so they were divorced. They married again, that didn't work. The kids, who knows what happened to them. And they look at this guy like a dinosaur, like a Neanderthal, you know. They said, well, look, you enjoy your divorces and everything else and the travails of modern life, which is not guided by something else. I will go home. My wife has prepared a sumptuous dinner with lots of people, stimulating company. I don't have to worry about my kids. Thank you very much. Sometimes let me know. I would like to know that you're well. You send me a card. But there's nothing to left there between, what are we talking about? You know, what, you want to cry on my shoulder, you have messed it up again, and then this again and that again, because these guys don't know what they really want. They maybe a bigger house, or maybe the cars. I saw a car, I need to get that car. Big things, you know. So my wife rescued me, like my daughter, two of my daughters. One married a man from yeshiva, he's a rabbi. The others, the two boys, they are truly religious. The kind of jump that my wife would have liked for me to take, I was never able to take. My son-in-laws are in that position of having been able to redirect their lives into those channels, and with hugely rewarding results for their sons and for everybody else. So you wanted to know what happened to this guy who was trying hard to survive the vicissitudes of life and bombardment and concentration camps and internment camps and everything else. In the end turned to gold or the diamonds. I met the right wife. Was she the beauty queen that I wanted to marry when I first came here? I had ideas, you know, I was going to be rich and I was going to have the most beautiful girl. Maybe, see, after a while we didn't need good, then I would kick her out like any good film star does, you know. I mean, you know, but and that instead of that I got a woman of quality, and and that's really what I really needed. Huh?
Okay, I think that was the only question I had. Did you guys have anything else?
I was curious how you managed to have all those pictures of your family that you brought over with you. Did you?
I don't know. I think some of them I got a sister and a brother of my father's had emigrated, had more sense than my father. Well, they were not as well off, which is the irony that the people who sometimes are a little bit too well off, like my father, take it too easy. They needed to take steps, and they came here. And I think some of the photos were in their position, and they ceded them to me graciously. So that's how I answer that question. What do you think, Leah? What do you get out of all this?
I don't know. I thought it was. I mean.
What is your background? What is your philosophical or alignment? What do you have other than that you want to have much money and so forth?
Well, I wanted to be a doctor more to help people, and I always had the interest in science, and the best way to combine that too was be a doctor, help people,
right.
Science.
But who are you?
Who am I? Yes, I'm a Reformed Jew from Houston, Texas, who wants to be a doctor.
What is a Reformed Jew think?
To me,
what are your loyalties? What are your
for me, it's more family oriented. The holidays are big where I come from. We always have. Each holiday, it's like my.
Yeah,
parents.
but what about? We will have. Hopefully, you'll have a nice family, and your kids will grow up. What will you tell them? how will you direct them? They will have temptation, you know. They meet friends. The friends may be good, they may be bad. Will they have the kind of strength, ideological strength to resist temptation no matter what? Or will they give you grief?
I don't know, but I hope not. I want to raise them Jewish.
Yeah.
So I hope that maybe that'll give them something, some sort of values to look towards.
Mm. Well, okay, good luck. What about you, John? You don't know.
No, I mean, I guess it's similar. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, you hope they
Yeah.
have good morals and
Yeah.
know what to do.
Okay. Well, Sarah, have you got some other question, or is that it?
I think that's it.
Did anything come up that was of interest in our interviews?
Well,
I mean-
quite a bit.
Yeah.
I
I did it in such a way that I didn't constrain myself from giving you what I consider insights that have come to me, whether they were convenient or whether they were flattering to, regardless. You know, I just that's what I have. You might say I'm opinionated, but the opinions have been bought dearly from experience. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.